Hi there, and welcome to this first recording. We're recording for week 2, Taiji and Qigong cultivation practices for the TCM practitioner here in our spring 2021 semester. Um, we were sent home with an article by Ed Neal to read called Introduction to Neijing Classical Acupuncture Part 1, History and Basic Principles. Although we won't be learning classical acupuncture in this class, we will be learning classical movement arts. And by classical, we can think about this as being from an era that preceded the modern era, right? So even traditional Chinese medicine has been pushed through the modern era. It's been filtered by the communist Chinese government. And we need to actually look back a little bit further, back towards the source texts and older history to really understand where our movement practices and where our medicine emerged from. So I'm hoping that everybody's read this article, and we're going to review a few of the salient points from it together. And then we'll move on from there. So what cosmology does Chinese medicine come from? And first, I just want to emphasize that we cannot approach Chinese medicine with a modern cosmology and expect to understand it completely. If we approach Chinese medicine with a modern cosmology that is what we've all grown up in, if we grew up in a post-industrial society, which I think we all have, then we're going to miss some of the most powerful ways that we come to understandings via Chinese medicine, via traditional Chinese medicine cosmology. So let's dig into that just a little bit and review what Ed Neal had to share with us. So the first thing we'll note is that there's an emphasis on cyclical observations and relationships, right? So how things emerge and how things return becomes very, very, very important. So we can think about applying this in a number of different ways. But some of the most immediate ones are like, okay, cyclical. What does cyclical mean? Cyclical means something that happens in a rhythm in a cycle, right? So most intimately to us, that would be our breath, right? So our inhale and our exhale, this is a cycle that we can see. And we can expect that these cycles that we see in ourselves will also be reflected in nature, and the cycles that are in nature will be reflected in ourselves. And this is sort of a holographic view of the universe that we can return to later. But in terms of cyclical observations, we can see that we have things like the breath, the heartbeat, these are cycles. We have eating and eliminating, this is a cycle. This all happens in our biology, but in the sort of macro world, we can see day and night. This is a cycle that we're intimately involved with and strongly affects our behavior, right? The seasons shifting, this is a cyclical thing that also strongly affects our behavior, right? So these cyclical observations, things expanding and then things contracting back, very, very interesting. And in fact, how things change becomes much more important to us than what things are. What the individual things are, this is of some interest, but really how they are changing, how they are engaging in these cycles. And we could talk about the 5-phase theory as something that details how these things change, or the I Ching, which we'll touch upon later also, as detailing sort of how things change, how do cycles work, right? And then these relationships that these create. Once we talk about relationships, we'll see that the traditional cosmological worldview works on much more associative principles, network principles, relational thinking. So as I mentioned, if we're thinking about figuring out what something is in a relational epistemology being a fancy word for how do you build knowledge, how do you know things about the universe, from our traditional Chinese medical standpoint, we're looking for how is this thing that we're looking at related to everything around it. So for instance, if we want to know what an object is from a modern cosmological standpoint, we might say, well, let's put it under a microscope and look at it. Let's break it down to its constituent parts, run it through a gas chromatograph and see what molecules or atoms make it up. Whereas in the traditional view, we say, well, what do you do with it? What was it before? What is it going to become later? Who participates with this, right? So if we take the archetypal ham sandwich, which for some reason is my favorite example when I think about like, what is something? You know, we know that it's made out of ham, which is protein and fat and carbohydrates, and it's got bread, and that's also carbohydrates, which have a certain caloric content. And then there's the mayonnaise, and you analyze each thing, you write a big list, what percentage, what weight, how many molecules, how many grams, all this kind of very quantitative information about what something is. Whereas if we wanted to know what a ham sandwich was from a more traditional cosmology, we say, well, what do you do with it? What was it before? Oh, it was a pig before, and it was a wheat before. Well, what are the qualities of a pig? And what are the qualities of wheat, you know? And then what do you do with it? Oh, you eat it. Well, what happens when you eat it? Well, it goes into your stomach. Well, what does the stomach do with it, right? All these relationships that are happening with it. Where did you buy the sandwich, right? all these different relationships around this object rather than what is, what's a description of the molecular composition of this object, right? How does this object participate in a web of relationships? That's what gives it meaning. And if we want to know something, we need to know these relationships, these associations around it, not just what is this in some reductionist kind of thinking, right? We can also say very confidently that our traditional cosmology emphasizes our own experience a little bit more. So the example I like to think of here is when Shennong, who's the Taoist sage, legendary historical, who lived in the hills of China, who originated much of what we know about Chinese herbology. The way that he figured out the beginnings of herbology was by living in a mountain and trying everything. What happens to my body when I eat this? What happens to my body when I drink this? What happens if I boil it and eat it? What happens if I fry it with honey and then eat it? And then he'd look inside his own experience and say, oh, well, this one seems to have increased my digestive capacity. This one made me sweat. This one made me warm. This one made me cold. This one made me poo, whatever it happens to be. So this subjective exploration of what's going on, as opposed to like, okay, here's a plant, let me put it into a test tube and through a gas chromatograph and see what's in it. That's okay, that gives us some information, but we might lose this subjective experience thing. And as we talk about Qigong, this becomes very important because our lens for Qigong, our instrument for Qigong is this, it's our body, right? It's our actual subjective experience, right? Our description of what Qi is only gonna get us so far. We can't put it in a test tube. People have tried it. The Russians spent a lot of time trying to do that. Not really successful. So our tool is our subjective experience, right? And so this sort of shifts our focus from trying to look at something out there and describe it versus trying to experience something in here and then figure out how it's related to things and how it changes over time, right? So fundamentally different way of pursuing knowledge. And then along these same lines, this idea of the interpenetration of the individual environment. We don't think ourselves as these floating sort of self-contained units floating through space, right? There's this idea that the universe is this living, breathing entity, and so are we, and our boundaries with it are porous, right? And we know this is true, right? We know that we put things into our bodies all the times and let things out of our bodies all the times, right? So we know that on a molecular basis, this is very, very true. We also know this on an energetic basis, right? We know that if you enter into a room full of excited, happy people, you naturally feel more excited and happy. And if you enter a room full of sick or depressed or angry people, you feel that as well. There's an interpenetration of what's going on out there and what's going on in here. And we could say this is an animate universe, right? So we are not a set of chemical reactions existing in a dead universe, or even not even like a spark of awareness or a soul animating something that otherwise would be dead. It's all alive, right? It's all alive. It's all moving. It's all changing. It's all breathing. And we participate that in a very direct, reciprocal way. We won't get to this vocabulary word much today, but there's a phrase called ganying. Ganying means reciprocity. It describes the relationship between ourselves and the universe, right? That this relationship is reciprocal. It gives and takes. It goes back and forth. And one of the ways that we assure our health is by maintaining this smooth reciprocity. An example of that would be if you try to stay up all night, it doesn't do great things for your health, right? We're not being reciprocal with the universe. If we try to go to the beach in the winter, we're not being in a reciprocal relationship with the universe, right? You don't sunbathe in the winter because that's not what's happening. You're connected with this universe. Your behaviors will be different in different situations based on this connection. Ed Neal goes on to describe some of the basic principles of classical Chinese medicine. And we'll go into these because I think they're very, very useful for us. So first of all, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, he describes the universe as a phenomenon of breath. I'll call it a phenomenon of qi, right? And we've already started to talk a little bit about what qi is. But breath serves just as well with the idea that it's a numinous experience that has a respiratory quality, something that ebbs and flows, something that gives and takes, right? And we say that the entire universe is a phenomenon of this qi. It's not the universe has qi or certain things in the universe have qi, but rather it is qi. And we look at our Einsteinian view of the universe, this, E equals mc squared, that energy equals matter times a constant based on the speed of light, tells us the same thing, that it's all energy, right? Some of the energy is moving very slow, and we think about this as solidity. or matter. Some of them energy is moving more fast, and we think about this as energy, right? As light or heat or emotion or breath, right? Another fundamental principle is that the way that we're going, the top level way that we're going to conceptualize this basic quality of the breath of the universe is via a contrasting pair of opposites, complementary pairs, right? So he calls it yin and yang. I'm going to go back a little bit further, call it heaven and earth or sky and the ground. Same thing, but the idea is that there's, if we want to understand nature's breath or nature's chi, we need to look at how it relates to two poles, right? One of them more quiescent and solid, one of them more active and open and less solid, right? So we could call these yin and yang, we can call them heaven and earth, and we can experience those directly because of this reciprocal embedded nature of our subjectivity in the universe, right? So we have a tool to feel nature's chi, nature's breath. And it's this tool is this thing that's situated between heaven and earth, between the yin of the earth and the yang of heaven, right? Generally, we can say that one of the principles of Chinese medicine is that motion can be identified as with or against the universal qi. What helped me get the best grasp of this principle is the idea of either being in a large river with a current or surfing, right? So the universe itself has a rhythm and it has a current, a direction, right? And it actually has many of these. So for instance, the current or direction in the morning is up and out, opening up, right? As the sun rises, energy also rises. The current in the spring is up and out, lifting and rising, right? In the evening, the current is in and down, right? Things come in, contract, the natural world starts to quiet down a little bit, it gets darker. This is also true of the fall, right? So there's lots of these rhythms, and as you get deeper into traditional Chinese medicine, you're going to learn about some of these biological rhythms specifically within your body. So we do have an organ clock, which is probably utilized by a lot of TCM practitioners, but it does have some sense with how the qi moves through the body, right? We also have the 5-phase theory of how one phase creates the next in a cycle, right? And if we move with this current, then things are easier. And if we move against this current, things are harder. Just like if you're paddling downstream, it's easier than paddling upstream. If you're surfing towards the beach, it's way easier than trying to push out through the breakers, right? Not that you can't do it, it's just much more difficult, right? So a big statement is qi is the fabric of space and time. And this is actually kind of loops straight back to the universe as a phenomenon of qi, is that we think that, you know, one of my wife said, you should just tell your students that qi is the matrix. And I was like, well, the matrix came out a long time ago, so I don't know exactly who's going to get the reference or not. But we do have this idea that qi is not something that happens within space and time. Qi actually is space and time. So everything you see around you, this computer in front of you, the sound of my voice, the room, all of it, this is all the fabric of space or time, or all energy, right? If we try to reduce qi to something smaller than that, then we're actually missing the big picture, and we're also missing on our ability to participate in this fully, because we've isolated to this little kind of thing that happens. And last week I said qi is not like some electrical current in a sausage of meat, right? That's not what qi is. It's the whole shebang, right? Okay, and then we have this idea that I've already touched on, that moving with the universal breath brings health and vitality, moving against it brings disease and death. And in fact, your entire job description as an acupuncturist or a Chinese medicine practitioner could be described as helping people move with the universal qi, right? Helping people move with the universal qi. What are you doing to help people find the ease of participating in these currents, right? So an example of that would be, you know, if I have a patient that's experiencing insomnia and they're going to bed every night at 2 and waking up every day sometime between 10 and 12, I can tell how they're not participating in the universal qi right there. Some people are a little bit more towards night owls, but I can tell you that if you're trying to go to bed at 2 and wake up sometime late in the morning, you're not moving with the universal qi. You're not moving with, we could think about it as sort of the genetic predispositions of your ancestors as well, right? We could also say, you know, in a sort of absurd idea, like if you want to move with the universal qi, you move in the direction that things go, right? So you eat a ham sandwich with your mouth, you don't eat it with your ear, right? So it's that simple as well, right? You move with the way that the currents are moving. And part of your study as TCM practitioners is to see those currents a little bit more. And some of these are very basic, like, okay, we have observed that if people eat heavier meals early in the morning, that moves with the universal qi, easier to digest, whereas if you eat them late at night, it moves against universal qi, less energy. And that has to do with organ circulation that we'll talk about later in your education if you haven't touched upon it as well. So the universe is a phenomenon of qi or of breath. The basic qualities of nature qi can be described as existing in a polarity or a spectrum of relationships between something dense and something open, yin and yang, earth and heaven. We can say that motion can be identified as with or against this universal qi. If we move with this universal qi, it brings health and vitality. If we move against it, disease and death, right? And lastly, just to sum it all up, that qi is a big picture thing, the fabric of space-time. It's not like an electrical current or anything that we reduce it to is going to be insufficient to describe the whole thing, right? With that in mind, I wanted to back up and now that we've given a little bit of context of how a classical cosmology informs Chinese medicine and thus Taiji and Qigong, I want to talk a little bit about how Taiji and Qigong fit into Chinese medicine. And this is actually something I cover in greater depth in the Cosmology for TCM practitioners or embodied cosmology course. But I do want to just give you guys a little bit of context, give you folks a little bit of context. So last time we talked about yang sheng, cultivating life, nourishing life, something like that. And the first three limbs that we see, meditation, nourishment, and movement, right? These are all self-care, right? These are all things that an individual does or a community does to promote their own health. It's not outside intervention. It's not something that somebody does to you. It doesn't take an expert to do these things, although there are better and worse ways to do them, right? And we'll look at them just very briefly here. As a group, meditation, nourishment, and movement. And our Taiji and Qigong falls squarely within this movement area, but there's a big overlap with meditation as well. And in fact, one thing I'm finding during these crazy COVID times is that people are drawn to Taiji and Qigong because it is a meditative movement. And although mindfulness practice has gotten a lot of popularity recently, a lot of folks find mindfulness practice difficult because there's not enough going on and their minds are a little bit too restless, or they have a little bit too much energy in their bodies to actually do it. So adding a movement component allows people to embrace the meditative component as well. And I hope that you folks find that as well. The next two limbs, and I'm going to circle back to these, so don't worry too much if it's a lot of information shortly. The fourth limb is feng shui and astrology. So we can think about this as space and time, orientations towards our relationships to space and orientations towards our relationships and time. The fifth one is often called divination or the I Ching. And I know some folks are not familiar with the I Ching, but this is called the Classic of Changes. And it's basically an oracular text that describes rhythms of change in the universe and a specific way of divining, of using what might appear to be like a random casting of stones or coins or yarrow stalks to figure out how the part of the moment that you're participating in interacts with the whole, with this associative model of the universe, right? This is something that the I Ching is something that Eastern scholars and Western scholars as well have spent so much time studying. And in fact, the legend is that Confucius, as he was on his deathbed or something, when they asked him, like, what would you have done different? He said, oh, I would have spent more time studying the I Ching. And he wrote a tremendous commentary on the I Ching that's still being used to this day. So it tells you that it is something that you can continue plumbing the depths of and keep coming up with more interesting ways of including this relational body of the examination of change to a practical application to your lives. We won't be getting into that very deeply, but I hope you all have some chance to explore it in the future. So the first three here that we could talk about as yang sheng, as self-care. The second two we could call mantic, which means sort of divinatory, or relationship between the part and the whole. And then the last three we have are pretty much what you're in school for, right? So the seventh is massage or tuina. The sixth is massage or tuina. The seventh is herbal medicine. And the very last is acupuncture. And I'll take this opportunity to note that ideally, this is the priority that we practice these also. So if we are practicing the first three limbs, then we might not need to use any of the other five limbs. If the first three limbs aren't working out, then maybe we apply a little bit of the fourth and the fifth limb to figure out why aren't things going right? What's going on with my set of relationships to space and time, to the part and the whole, that is making things not happen? Like where am I missing how to flow with the universe, right? And then the last three, massage, herbal medicine, acupuncture, this is the realm of expert intervention. This is when somebody who knows something more than you do comes in and diagnoses your condition and then applies something from the outside to fix you. So let's look at each of these just a little bit more deeply. First three, how we conduct ourselves and manage our situation. We could think about this as preventive medicine, and we've already mentioned meditation, nourishment, and movement. Meditation, if you don't have a meditation practice, I can't emphasize enough how much it will benefit you to have one. But we will talk more about meditation when we talk about the principle of cultivation, which I'm hoping to cover briefly in our next lecture together as a discussion. But when we think about meditation, we're cultivating presence, raw awareness, feeling awareness, which we spoke about last time, and a sense of being here now. And I can tell you that if you are able to practice some presence, it will help the people you're interacting with. It'll help your patients, right? If we want to draw analogs to modern medicine, we may think that meditation is sort of analogous to mental health, but this undersells it. It's not psychology, and it's not problem solving, right? It's sort of cultivating a stronger foundation so you don't need to solve problems, or rather cultivating an awareness to put your problems into a perspective where they can have some capacity to self-resolve, right? But it is the first limb. I'm calling this nourishment, not nutrition, because nutrition makes you think of calories and calcium, magnesium, carbohydrates, lipids, all that kind of stuff. Nourishment is a little bit different. Nourishment is about, what you eat, how you absorb it. So how you absorb it is really critical. People miss the how you absorb it point all the time. There's a recurrent demographic that seeks acupuncture care here in Berkeley in the East Bay, which is the sort of, quasi new agey. It's usually women, but there are some men involved too, who are sort of obsessed with yoga and try to exist on a diet of smoothies and salads, right? And they often have really chronic loose stools, digestive problems, menstrual issues, and fatigue. Everything they're putting in their body, if we looked at its nutrition, is probably pretty good. These hyper-powered smoothies and everything and the salads, but their bodies can't absorb it because it's not what humans are supposed to be eating, right? They're great nutrition, poor nourishment because of poor absorption, right? And we can get deep down this hole. I just want to use that as a quick case study of sort of how we can think about how nourishment is different than nutrition. You have to not only have good stuff in what you're putting in your mouth, but the capacity to absorb it, which often has to do with digestive fire. So this is analogous, but not identical to diet. And it's certainly not counting calories or nutrients. And we'll also note that nourishment plays in with our ideas of the cyclical universe. And way before sort of modern, I'm thinking post-60s ideas of like eat local, eat organic, eat seasonal, all that kind of stuff came into vogue. The Chinese have been saying, yes, if you want to stay healthy, eat what's grown around you. Eat what's in season, right? The natural world is offering you what's best for the season. So for instance, in the peak of summer, where the risk of a condition called summer heat is highest, nature gives us this wonderful gift of the watermelon, which I think is shigua in Chinese medicine. And watermelon is a perfect antidote. It's an herbal medicine, also a food, that treats the disorder that's presenting itself right then. Just like in the winter, root vegetables and stews are what we're supposed to be eating. And the root vegetables all come, we get a lot of them at the supermarket during the late fall and early winter. So nourishment relates to these larger cycles. The third one is the one that we're talking about mostly in this class. Just to give you context, movement, we'll call it TaiJiandQiGong, but sometimes called Neigong or Daoyin. We could broadly call it exercise and get into a discussion about what Qigong, Neigong, Daoyin, how they're different from just normal exercise. This is a picture from the Mawangdui texts, which was a tomb that was unearthed. I think it's the 2nd century of the Han Dynasty, 2nd century Han Dynasty. 200 AD or something like that. And they had these pictures of people doing exercises. This was called Daoyin, but we can think about this as being Neigong or Qigong. And we can actually recognize some of the activities we're doing here that exist in modern sense as well, right? But suffice it to say, this idea that you need to move the body, and there's specific ways to move the body that allow you to participate more in this direction of universal qi, right? So that sort of rounds out our first three. The middle group is Semantic Arts, and this is like a topic of its own graduate degrees in each of these. And if you are interested in feng shui, I recommend you do check out the Golden Gate School of Feng Shui that offers course material in greater detail for this, and also astrology, I Ching, and divination. But just to quickly summarize, the idea of this middle group is that we're looking at subtle patterns in the outside world and to indicate how our relationship might be disturbed, right? So in feng shui, we think about how health is related to space, right? It's not just hanging a crystal so that you get more money, right? But it has to do with how you can arrange a space so that things move smoothly through it and that it meets its goals. So good feng shui for a train station is going to be different than good feng shui for a restaurant, which is going to be different than good feng shui for a bedroom, which is going to be different than good feng shui for your mother's grave, right? All these things are different applications of feng shui, preserving the idea that the reason you're doing these things is to create a correct relationship to space, a correct flow through space, right? So someplace where you want things to keep moving, you're going to have a different set of expectations than someplace where you want things to become quiet, right? So a library is going to be different than the entrance to a concert space, right? Different feng shui, different relationship. And how things are related and set up in space actually impacts our own personal health as well. So a very traditional set of recommendations for somebody with a health problem that won't go away is we might think about, well, where are you living? And some of this is straightforward, like I can't sleep at night. I live next to a train yard. It's really noisy. Okay, that's also feng shui. Like it's not magic. It's like you need to move away from these noisy trains, right? Or my bones hurt and I'm cold all the time. I live in a damp basement. Well, we can pump you full of herbs all we want until you move out of the damp basement. Your health isn't going to improve very much because your problem is feng shui. It's a problem about your relationship to space, right? It's not actually an internal problem so much as an external problem, right? So we can think about this as environmental health very, very broadly, right? And this is a fascinating area of study. And we have these tremendous devices like the Lopan Feng Shui compass here that sets up this tremendous set of relationships between different theories and different directions in space. Where we're going to see our relationship to feng shui most present for what we do here is when we get into our taiji form and we start to identify the directions, our own personal directions. And our taiji practice actually helps us relate to space by setting up a very deliberate sort of awareness of space around us, right? More on that later. Astrology, very, very briefly. Astrology is what you might think it is, which is like, what's this day like for me because I was born in December, right? And then back in the newspaper or whatever. But more essentially, astrology is how our health is related to time and cycles. Anytime we talk about astrology, we need to talk about the most important astrological relationship we have, which is that to a star that's the closest to us, which is the sun, right? And this is an undeniable astrological relationship that we have. Night and day are different, right? And night and day affect our health and our rhythms. There's just no question on a very, very biological level. If we wanted to expand that a little bit, we could say that, okay, our relationship to the sun object has to do with our seasonal health, right? So, whether the earth is the northern hemisphere where we live is closer to the sun or further from the sun, depending on the angle of the axis of rotation, this is our seasonal health, right? But it also governs, circadian rhythms and also the aging process. There's a 60-year cycle that's noted. We just started a new cycle, actually, a new 12-year cycle, because it's year of the rat, end of the year of the rat. We're about to enter year of the ox, which is the next one. This 12-year cycle is hooked up with the 5 phases. 12 times 5 is 60. So there is a 60-year cycle that we can talk about as well. You can specialize in this area of medicine. You're not going to find much information about it in TCM school because it has been largely ripped out by post-communist education in the version of the Chinese medicine that we found. But there's a very, very, very detailed body of information about how astrology affects health. And I will say personally that some of this is way out of left field, and I think it's a bunch of hoo-ha, and I think some of it is profoundly, profoundly interesting. So we're not going to explore it right now, but I will just sort of let you know that this is part of the traditional tool set that we would use to help resolve a patient's health issue. An example might be like, oh yes, well, You may have a patient come to you with a specific complaint, and you actually look at their astrological signs and chart, and you say, well, this problem is not likely to resolve itself until next year because of this arrangement of your personal sort of relationships to cycles. So without going into details, we'll just kind of gesture in that direction and say, here's an interesting box that you can open if you want to later on. The I Ching, the main way that we experience the I Ching in Chinese medicine is just by recognition of the fact that we can use these solid and broken lines called the gua to describe different situations and different relationships. Really, anytime we talk about the I Ching, we're talking about how things change. How do things cyclically evolve? And this is something, again, that we could spend a lot of time studying. For our purposes right now, we can just think about it as how do we use small indicators that are immediate to us to put us in relationship to larger changes that are happening in the universe? How do situations cyclically evolve, and what is our response to them? How the microcosm of our own experience is related to the macrocosm of the universe. There's a lot of stuff that we can get into here, but we need to focus a little bit more on the Taiji and Qigong, just showing you that there are aspects of our medicine that have been created in direct reference to the I Ching. In your TCM education, you probably experienced mostly with the Gua, which is just these 3 lines that maybe we'll get into later this semester. The last 3 limbs are expert intervention. This is an expert comes and helps you out, right? So massage, herbal medicine, acupuncture. Massage is minimally invasive. You move what's stuck physically and energetically. We can think about it as relating to something like physical therapy or chiropractic or any of these other hands-on therapies. We don't use needles, right? That's really, Tui Na is acupuncture without the needles, right? Movement, you're moving yourself in the second limb that we talked about, or maybe the third limb we talked about, movement, whereas this, you're passive. So one is an active intervention and one is a passive reception of an intervention from an expert, right? And you will learn a little bit of Tui Na in our course. I will say that those that spend more time on their palpatory skills and using their hands become way better acupuncturists than those that don't. So I do recommend that you take these Tui Na courses seriously and take every opportunity. I know, difficult and shelter in place. Every opportunity you can to actually put your hands on the people you're treating, right? Put your hands on them. And so palpatory skills, the massage therapists, Tui Na practitioners are gonna come into their Chinese medicine education with a tremendous, tremendous leg up for people that don't have that. We think with our hands in Chinese medicine, we feel pulses, we feel bodies, all this kind of stuff. We locate points with our hands. My hope is that people courses as seriously as they can. It's going to make you a much better practitioner. Then we have herbal medicine, right? So herbal medicine contrasted to nourishment is stronger plant, animal, and mineral substances to change a health situation. It's a little bit of a stronger correction. We don't have a straight line between food and herbs, right? So everything has an effect on your body. So on one end of the spectrum, we have really gentle stuff like food. Then we have cooking spices. Then we have things that are a little bit stronger than cooking spices. Then we have the things all the way over here that make you vomit, pee, poo, or sweat, right? So we have all the substances in our materia medica. Herbal medicine is much more corrective or diagnostic. The goal of nourishment of diet is to support normal, right? To support normal, ideally with local, seasonal food, right? That's cooked at home, right? This is the ideal. Whereas herbal medicine is much more strongly corrective, like something's further out of whack and we want to kind of grab the steering wheel and move it back towards center a little bit more strongly. And it takes much more diagnostic nuance than just prescribing chicken soup, Start with the chicken soup though, right? And lastly, we have acupuncture. And this is sort of the part that's always bothered me is that here we are, Chinese medicine practitioners that by the time you're done, you'll have studied all this other stuff and you leave and they just call you an acupuncturist. And we do so much more. And in fact, I would say the places where we can have the biggest impact on our patients' health are much more around, helping them with self-care, helping them with movement and cooling off their mental state and helping them eat the right foods and participate meaningfully in the cycles of the universe around them. But we're known as acupuncturists, right? So acupuncture is an invasive correction that involves piercing the skin. Only experts can do it. It's pretty strong therapy, actually. You can do a lot of great things with acupuncture. And y'all are going to be spending a whole bunch of your time learning all these intimate actions, locations, and things like that with acupuncture points. But just to put it in context, it's considered sort of towards the end of our tool set. It's almost like a last resort. You've done all this other stuff. What are you going to do? I guess you'll do acupuncture, right? Which isn't to say that you can use acupuncture in a more harmonizing way. You know, I do that all the time, where patients just come in and say, "Oh, I just want an acupuncture tune-up," and wow, what a great way to receive the medicine, right? What a great way. And it's a good way to apply the medicine, as long as a person doesn't have all the other stuff completely out of whack, right? So if somebody is eating all the wrong stuff, not moving with the seasons, not moving their body, not sleeping when they're supposed to sleep, then, you know, your acupuncture can open a window for temporary relief, but we don't have any faith that it's going to do anything in the long term, right? Let's see what else I have here. Okay, so that's actually all I want to cover in terms of slides today. And I think that's a good start for our first remote lecture. We'll see how the information goes down, and we'll see sort of how much of this we need to review in person and how much further we can get. My hope, again, is to do more sort of talking and discussion in class and try to get the lecture stuff a little bit more out of the way. You all do have a handout that I sent out. And one thing I'll just let you all know is that at the top of this handout is some acupoint vocabulary, right? And I've talked about this sort of area of the back of the wrist. I'm not going to necessarily quiz anybody about the specific details about these points, because I know some of you are further and some of you are less far in your TCM education, but it's worth starting to learn these points, at least take a look at them. I have found it tremendously impactful to look at all this information from all sorts of different angles. So you learn about something in acupoint location, then you hear about it in Qigong, then you hear about it in Tuinan. All these things start to make it gel and kind of make more sense. So all three of these points are on the back of the wrist, the yang side of the wrist, right? We have SI5, SJ4, and large intestine 5 across the back of the wrist. For our Qigong purposes, we don't need to have a super precise location for these, but rather we use them to describe anatomical locations in a very a pithy way, right? The other thing that we have on our handout is a little bit of description of some words from the Western idiom about describing how we feel in space. So we have proprioception, which is like Wikipedia says is a sense of relative positioning of neighboring parts of the body, right? So where's my arm relative to my arm? And this is something we work with a lot in Taiji and Qigong. And we say that it's interoreceptive, which intero means inside, right? So, you know, most of our sense receptors are extero, right? Tells you what's going on outside. I can see something over there. I can hear something over there. But we have some sense faculties that sense the inside of our body. And this interoreceptive sense faculty is really, really interesting to us. It falls broadly under touch, but it's a little bit different, right? And another related term that we can think about is kinesthesis, which is the perception attendant upon the movement of the muscles. What does it feel like to move your body, right? And then there's two quotes at the bottom that are from some Taiji books that I enjoy, and they start to get us to think about how our movement practice of Taiji helps us participate in the cosmology of Chinese medicine, right? So the reason that the course that I teach is called Embodied Cosmology later on is it's a little bit unique, right? It's not a theoretical cosmology that exists as a thought model, but rather it's a cosmology that we are intimately enmeshed in. It's an embodied cosmology. This body that we have allows us to participate in this cosmology, and we can observe it directly, right? So read those quotes at the bottom of the handout, and there's a little bit of technical stuff going on. There's a type of a certain energetic quality that we'll start to try to bring out in our Taiji practice called Pengjing, which we'll talk about next time. In any case, I hope this lecture has been helpful for y'all, and I look forward to covering it a little bit more, reviewing it where we need to, moving a little bit further where we need to when we meet on Thursday, and also moving together, which is a lot of fun.